Dear attendees, thank you for giving me the floor. Let me start by briefly introducing myself. So I'm Vincent Dewulf, a 25-year-old from Flanders, Belgium. Last year, I was still a full-time student at the Catholic University of Leuven, where I studied theology and church history, among other things. It was in the context of my master thesis in church history that I did research on the vision of Pope Benedict on the European Union. I have been working as a teacher of Roman Catholic religion for a few weeks now, and I'm in my final year student of canon law as well. In February last year, I also visited the beautiful city of Krakow with friends from my Catholic Student Association in Leuven. During the next 20 minutes, I will try to tell you something more about Benedict's vision of the European Union. A first important note that you should bear in mind is that Benedict wrote about the European Union primarily in the period before his pontificate, so then as a Cardinal Ratzinger. The two most important contributions on this are his book entitled European Today and Tomorrow Addressing Fundamental Issues from 2004 and a presentation that he gave the day before the death of Pope John Paul II. The lecture he gave then was about Europeans' crisis of culture, which immediately reveals how he views the European Union at that time. With this in mind, let us look at Ratzinger's vision on the European Union. I will discuss three main points in turn. First, we will look at how Ratzinger saw European cooperation. In the second movement, I will delve deeper into his specific expectations of the European Union, as well as how he saw the role of the church in all this. And finally, we will delve deeper into criticism he made. The hope he once cherished was that of a European cooperation story based on Christian values that has not been fulfilled and even turned into its opposite. So first, uh, it is important to look at the question, is Ratzinger in favor of more European cooperation or not? So he was in line with his predecessors, who from Benedict XV, around 1914 onwards, had all been in favor of more European cooperation. This cooperation aimed to bring about peace and stability on the European continent. Such cooperation should therefore only take place with countries that all fell in line with the Christian tradition. Islamic countries, certainly according to Ratzinger, should not be part of this unification story. Later, as Pope, he even called the possible accession of Turkey to the European Union a serious mistake against the flow of history. Orthodox Christian countries, on the other hand, did have a place within the European Union, because just like his predecessor John Paul II, he was a great advocate to the integration of the former Eastern Bloc countries into the European Union. According to him, the accession of these countries to the European Union could contribute to freedom, the rule of law, and democracy in these countries. The European Union could make a positive contribution not only for countries within Europe. According to Benedict, the European Union should also take a leading role in promoting peace internationally, combating the international problem of poverty, and even tackling problems concerning our planet. The European Union had already taken this leading role since its inception in the 90s, and this was a development that made Ratzinger particularly fond of the European Union in this area. However, according to Ratzinger, cooperation should not only be about more freedom or democracy or be based purely on economic principles, but should be based on Christian values with human dignity as a starting point. According to him, what connects Europe is a Christian tradition and heritage. Christianity has helped shape Europe over the past 2 millennia, and these roots should not be denied. This should therefore form the first basis of cooperation within Europe. Only in the second place comes economic advantages or democratic gain. A final example that shows that Ratzinger was in favor of more Europe is his choice of a name as a pope. It is not coincidence that he chose the name Benedict, referring to Benedict of Nursia, This saint and founder of the Benedictine order is also the patron saint of the European continent. With this, he wanted to create a deep bond between his pontificate on the one hand and the continent of Europe on the other, which at the time was in deep cultural crisis. So far, Ratzinger's vision on European cooperation is a vision that mainly came about in the years before his pontificate. So now we know that he is certainly not against European cooperation, but he does set certain conditions for this cooperation. According to Benedict, starting from the Christian roots of the continent should be an ultimate basis for all of this. In doing so, he also cherishes a certain hope for Europe, and in particular, the role that the church can play in this whole unification story. He says that when churches get involved into public debate, when they express reservations or recall various principles, this does not constitute from a form of intolerance or interference, but that the main focus of the church interventions is precisely the protection of and promotion of human dignity. For Pope Benedict, Christianity can play a major role in providing Europe with the spiritual unity that is needed. At the beginning of the third millennium, there were several discussions in the European Union about the role of religion. One of the first discussions was a discussion whether or not God and Christianity should be included in the European Constitution, which I shall tell you more about later. A second discussion was about the possible cooperation between the European Union and religions, which were concretely reflected in the Treaty on the Functioning of Europe. This state, among other things, that a constant dialogue between the European Union and religions is of great importance. Former French President Nicolas Sarkozy called this attitude laïcité positive, so a more positive interpretation of the French principle of laïcité. Benedict finds these two positions, so of both the European Union and of Sarkozy, to be a very positive change within the European Union, and he hopes that the Church can benefit from this. He hopes that the European Union will even go a step further. And about this, he says, among other things, that the European Union can only be enriched by engaging with its Christian tradition. Spiritual renewal and returning to Christian roots are central for Benedict. If the European Union engages more with its Christian identity in the future, it can thus achieve a renewed spiritual unity on the continent and a strengthening of values and human rights. Two things that, according to the Pope, are necessary. The role of the Church in this is to ensure that the European Union can discover these Christian roots and grow spirituality from them. For Benedict, recognition of the role of Christianity in this is therefore essential. It will be even better if these were also institutionalized in the structures of the European Union, such as in the European Constitution. All this can only benefit the European Union. In addition to Benedict's vision of European cooperation, we now also know what hopes he cherished in this regard, as well as what the role of the church could be in this whole story. So now in a third movement, I want to go deeper into the criticism he made about the European Union, a criticism that arose from the hope that was not fulfilled. This third movement should not be seen as a third step in a process. I discuss this as third because it is clear to end with his criticism, but Benedict often formulated this criticism together with his vision on European cooperation or the role that the church can play in this. Nevertheless, it is important to devote a separate section to this because his criticism, especially during his last years, took the upper hand in his discourse. However, what exactly are this criticism? In my explanation, I will try to keep the previous section in mind, where we went deeper into his hope for the European Union and the role that the church can play in all this. This hope often turned into despair, and the role of the church remained underexposed during his pontificate. Let me give two examples of criticism. So first, he criticized how the unification of Europe process has exactly taken shape. In several speeches, he points out that sufficient attention must be paid to national minorities and different cultural traditions in this process. The European Union must not erase the identity of different countries. Because this is not the case, the impression arises that not everyone shares the European unification process and that this process does not take into account people's aspirations. Benedict criticizes the prevailing culture within the European Union, a culture that is based on a growing drink of uniformity, permeated by secularism that is often also critical of Christianity. All this leads to an extreme relativism and a disoriented society. Benedict's wish was to build a European cooperation story based on the Christian values and traditions. Within the European Union, religion is not given the place it deserves. It is sometimes even excluded from the public sphere and pushed into the private sphere. And in its place, its culture is built that is even based on the principle of a radical enlightenment. He had he had a hard time with the latter in particular, because in this way, the Christian roots of Europe is being ignored, and any reference to God is missing. Benedict believes that all this has negative consequences for the European society. So this was his first criticism. A second criticism concerns his view on the institutionalization of religion in the structures of the European Union, something that did not happen sufficiently. Let me explain this with the help of an example, namely the European Convention on Human Rights. For Pope Benedict, Christian values such as dignity and solidarity come directly from God, because these values form the foundation of human rights treaties. These treaties therefore have a divine character. This ensures that human rights are inviolable and acquire a non unmanageable character. If something comes directly from God, it is not subject to human arbitrariness. They are therefore not created by a political legislator but exist on their own and come from God, which means that the legislator must comply with them. Without the connection with God, they lose all their power. When one then denies the divine origin for the sake of a so called freedom agenda or democracy weakness, and therefore is renewed is a renewed risk of oppression, a renewed attention for these Christian values, as well as a recognition of their divine origin, can restore the current democracy that, according to him, is in decline. In this way, the European Union can spiritually renew itself again. Again, Benedict's great wish was that the European Union would reorganize itself around its Christian roots, and he hoped that this would translate into a recognition of God or Christianity into the European Convention on Human Rights. Quote none. This was a second example of criticism on Ratzinger's part. I would like to briefly move on to my conclusion. So, Pope Benedict, especially in the years before his pontificate, cherished enormous hopes for Europe. All this mainly revolved around the recognition of Europe's Christian roots, which would give the European cooperation project a common divine dimension. Various examples have shown that this hope is never fulfilled, which is why it turned into a kind of despair. This is why Benedict often became more critical of the European Union and was called sometimes anti Europe in various media. For example, both his predecessor and predecessor and successor, received the Charlemagne Prize, a prize for a leader, a world leader, who is committed to European cooperation. He did not. This illustrates that the way in which we remember his contribution to Europe is often somewhat more negative. Okay, this was my presentation on Pope Benedict and also during his cardinalate of Ratzinger on the European Union. I want to thank you for your attention and I hope you found it interesting. Thank you.